Imagine someone who once produced brilliant work effortlessly, just a hollow echo where inspiration used to live, staring at a screen, willing an idea to appear. What if the secret wasn't trying harder, but stepping away? To outsiders, it seemed like magic, a spring that never dried up. The harder they pushed for a meaningful breakthrough, the farther it slipped. What flowed freely turned into a locked gate. The change didn't arrive through more struggle. As soon as the obsession with the outcome faded, clarity crept back in. The more you sabotage the very steps that create them, your focus, then your actions get sharper. Facing an empty page can feel heavier than it should. Drag something meaningful out of your skull, but the harder you press, the more everything tightens. Ideas don't form, they shatter. What should feel natural starts to feel like a machine grinding gears, even though you're doing exactly what you were taught. Try harder, you stare longer, you demand progress as if pressure alone could manufacture it. Instead of clarity, you get white noise. That's where the breaking begins. Every pause feels like proof of inadequacy. Then something changes, not because you cracked the code. You push back from the desk, and in that distance, an unexpected thing happens, as if it had been waiting for you to get out of the way. The problem was never a shortage of effort. There is a world of difference, nourishes action and effort that smothers it, until the day they sat down and found nothing. You've been there. The more you squeeze your mind, the drier it gets. There was a thinker, celebrated for sharp insights and relentless output. But then the well ran dry. What once felt fluid became mechanical. The tighter you hold, the emptier your hands. It appeared when they surrendered the need to force an answer. This reveals a quiet law. The more you cling to results, but when you shift your attention to what you truly command, your effort is calmer and surprisingly powerful. At first it seems simple. Concentrate, dig deeper. So you lean in and try to beat clarity into existence. Thoughts don't flow, they freeze. Have you ever felt your mind turn against you like that? And with that grinding comes frustration, a quiet whisper that something is wrong. So you persist. You replay scraps of old ideas, hoping one will bloom into something whole. But instead of forward motion, you meet resistance. And slowly, your attention drifts away from the process and toward the prize, because now every second without a breakthrough feels like a failure. Pressure doesn't produce, it pollutes, but because you stopped strangling it. You loosen your grip, the idea comes back. Quietly, without demand, that's when a new understanding dawns. It was the kind of effort you were using. Between effort that, when you attempt to oversee every single step, you shrink your awareness. You try to bulldoze something that does not respond well to force. Thought, creativity, insight, they don't accelerate because you yell at them. They slow down, retreat, and hide until the pressure disappears. This pattern isn't just about writing. It shows up everywhere, in conversations, in sports, in relationships. Watch. The more you try to twist a certain outcome into reality, the more unnatural your movements become. You hesitate where you should act. You overcorrect. You start calculating instead of responding. And that calculation kills your rhythm. Instead of moving forward, you pause, you second guess, you question. What once felt automatic becomes a chore. That chore creates friction, not in the world around you, but inside your own chest. Here the Stoic lens comes into focus. You can act, you can prepare, you can concentrate, but the final result is never yours to command. The instant you try to seize it directly, you generate tension, because you're reaching beyond your actual territory. That tension doesn't always announce itself as tension. Sometimes it masquerades as responsibility, as if you're doing everything possible to make things work. But underneath there is a constant pulse of need, for something to happen, for everything to align. And that need warps your actions. The blank page becomes more than a page. A simple chat becomes a performance review. Everything becomes a test, something to prove, something to lock down. Once that happens, the process collapses. You are no longer engaged with what you're doing. You are engaged with where you hope it leads. That shift, even subtle, is enough to tear everything apart. There's a quiet law behind all this. The more you attempt to govern what isn't yours, the weaker you become in what is. But when that clinging loosens, something else arises. A steady, grounded focus. You still act, still move, but there's far less strain. You aren't constantly checking for returns. You aren't measuring every move. You simply do what's in front of you. And in that state, your actions become cleaner, more accurate, more aligned. Not because you're forcing them, but because you've removed the interference. So when you look back, you see clearly. Nothing was missing, no talent, no discipline. What was missing was space, room for the mind to wander without pressure, room for action to develop without constant meddling. Once that space returns, everything starts working, not perfectly, not instantly, but steadily and naturally. The outcomes you chased start showing up, not because you muscled them into place, but because you got out of their way. If this resonates with you, then subscribing to Winds of Thought isn't just about watching more videos. It's about refining how you think, how you act, and how you stand under pressure. So if that path calls you, consider subscribing. A quiet step toward a clearer, more disciplined mind. That space is easy to ignore because it doesn't feel like action. It feels like stepping back, releasing, doing less. But in reality, it's the foundation that lets everything else function. Without it, effort becomes counterproductive. With it, even simple tasks carry more weight. This is the quiet paradox at the heart of it all. The tighter you grip the outcome, the faster it slips away. But when you release that grip, even a little, things begin to align. Not because you quit trying, but because you started trying in a way that no longer fights against you. There's a subtle expansion that begins once you step back from that first flash of frustration, and it doesn't stay locked to a blank page or a single chore. It spreads into other domains, repeating in patterns you might miss. The same tension that chokes creativity also appears in conversations, decisions, and moments of performance. It's not always obvious, but the pattern holds. The harder you push for a specific outcome, the more unnatural your behavior gets, and when actions lose their natural rhythm, the prize drifts further away. At first, it seems like the fix is obvious. Just pour on more effort. Focus harder, care deeper. That's what most people are taught. And in many situations, it works. But some processes hate pressure. They need something else, something gentler and more aligned. When the mind gets fixated on results, it starts operating in a twisted way. Instead of reacting to what is actually happening, it tries to pre-control what hasn't happened yet. That shift creates an internal friction that quietly undermines everything. You feel this most in high-stakes moments. When attention slides away from the task and onto the outcome, something changes. Movements that were once automatic become stiff. Thoughts that flowed like water turn into broken glass. You start monitoring yourself in real time, analyzing each step instead of just taking it. And by doing that, you interrupt the very engine that lets you perform well. It's not that your ability vanished, it's that your connection to it weakened. So the breakdown doesn't stem from a lack of skill. It comes from an overload of interference. The brain stops acting and starts calculating. It tries to forecast instead of respond. And while that might sound intelligent, it usually leads to hesitation. Every action gets filtered through expectation. Every decision gets weighed against a future result. And in that endless evaluation, the present moment gets lost. The now is the only place you can actually move. Epictetus once said, "Make the best use of what is in your power, and take the rest as it happens." That simplicity is easy to miss. When attention stays inside what you can actually control, action remains steady. But when it reaches beyond, trying to sculpt outcomes directly, tension builds. And that tension doesn't help performance, it wrecks it. What's interesting is that this doesn't feel like interference. It feels like taking things seriously, like being responsible. But beneath that sits a growing strain, a sense that you're trying to hold everything together at once, and the more you fight to maintain that control, the more unstable it becomes. There's a natural rhythm to effective action. It doesn't mean things are easy, and it doesn't mean effort disappears. But the effort is directed, focused, and rooted in the present. When that rhythm is intact, actions flow one after another without second thoughts. No need to constantly check, tweak, or reassess. The process moves on its own. But when the mind gets attached to the result, that rhythm shatters. Instead of moving forward, you stop, reconsider, worry whether what you're doing is enough, whether it will lead where you want. That hesitation introduces gaps where none should exist. It trades momentum for uncertainty. Over time, this becomes a loop. The more you interfere, the less effective your actions get. The less effective they get, the more you feel the urge to interfere. Without realizing it, you become your own worst enemy. Not because you lack discipline or work ethic, but because your effort is being applied in a disruptive way. That's where awareness starts to matter, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet repositioning of attention. Instead of trying to control everything, you begin to see where your influence actually ends. You recognize that certain outcomes cannot be forced, no matter how badly you want them. And that recognition changes your approach. It doesn't make you passive. It doesn't cut your effort. If anything, it refines it. You start placing your attention more carefully on what you can actually do, not on what you hope will happen. And by doing that, you shed the unnecessary pressure that was clouding your actions. The result is subtle but huge. Actions become cleaner, decisions quicker. Less second-guessing, less hesitation. Not because you suddenly have more certainty, but because you've stopped trying to control the uncontrollable. You work inside the borders of your influence instead of pushing against them. Within those borders, something opens up. You have more room to respond to what's actually happening, rather than to your fears or expectations. Your attention becomes more grounded, more present. And in that state, performance improves, not through force, but through alignment. This pattern keeps repeating, not as a problem, but as a signal. Every time you feel that tension, that urge to force an outcome, it's a sign that your focus has drifted beyond your true control. And each time you pull it back, even slightly, you restore the natural rhythm. So the issue was never trying too little. It was trying in a way that interferes. Once that sinks in, the approach changes. Effort remains, but it gets quieter, more precise, less reactive. And in that shift, the process finally works as it was always meant to. There's a version of this pattern that gets even clearer when other people enter the picture. It doesn't show up as a blank page or a frozen idea, but as a subtle tension in how someone carries themselves. You can feel it in a conversation, in their tone, in the way they choose words. Someone tries a little too hard to sound impressive, to appear confident, to make sure they're seen a certain way. Even if nothing is said outright, something feels off, not dramatically, not in a way you can easily name, but enough to create distance. The effort isn't obvious. In fact, it's often disguised as enthusiasm or self-assurance. But underneath that, there's pressure, a need to be perceived in a particular light, a quiet urgency for validation, and that urgency leaks into everything. Speech speeds up. Focus shifts from genuine connection to performance. Instead of simply being present, there's a constant radar scanning how you're being received. And here's the contradiction. The more someone tries to shape how they are seen, the less natural they appear. The more they try to prove their value, the more uncertain they seem. Not because they lack value, but because the act of proving creates tension. And tension, even subtle, is something people pick up on instantly. It's a strange dynamic. On the surface, effort should help. If you want respect, you show your strengths. If you want to be liked, you present yourself well. Those things are true up to a point. But there's a line where effort becomes force, where expression turns into performance. Once that line is crossed, the effect reverses. Instead of drawing people in, it creates unease. Instead of building trust, it raises quiet questions, not conscious, just impressions. A sense that something is being pushed rather than revealed. Most of the time, this isn't intentional. It's driven by something deeper. A need to secure a certain outcome, to ensure others see you in a specific light. That need hijacks everything. It shifts your attention away from the moment and onto the impression you're manufacturing. You start adjusting in real time, filtering words, measuring reactions. And while that might look like control, it actually destroys your ability to respond naturally. You're no longer fully engaged with what's happening. You're managing it. That's where the disconnect lives, because real connection doesn't come from control. It comes from presence, from being fully engaged without constantly checking how you're landing. The moment presence is replaced by performance, something gets lost. Not dramatically, but enough to be felt. Seneca pointed toward this when he said, "Care more for a good conscience than for what others say of you." It's not a rejection of others. It's a shift of focus. When your attention is anchored internally, your actions become more stable. But when it's tied to external approval, you become reactive. You start adjusting based on imagined responses rather than real ones. That reactivity creates instability because you can never fully control how others see you. Too many variables, different perspectives, different expectations, different interpretations. Trying to manage all that at once isn't just hard, it's impossible. So what happens instead? Overcompensation. You try a little harder, emphasize a little more, push just enough to make sure your message lands, but each adjustment adds more tension. Over time, that tension becomes the dominant signal, overshadowing whatever you were trying to say. The way out of this isn't withdrawal or indifference. It's removing the need to prove something in every interaction, letting your actions stand on their own without constant reinforcement. When that need fades, something shifts immediately. Less pressure behind your words, less urgency in your presentation. You are no longer trying to control every exchange, so your attention returns to the moment itself. You listen more clearly, respond more directly. Less filtering, less hesitation. That creates a different kind of presence, one that doesn't need to announce itself. It's steady, grounded, and genuinely more authentic. Not because you're trying to seem authentic, but because you've stopped trying to seem like anything at all. People respond to that without knowing why. There's a sense of ease, a lack of strain that makes interaction feel natural, and ironically, the very things you were trying to force, respect, interest, connection, begin to appear without being chased. This doesn't mean effort disappears, it just changes direction. Instead of being used to shape perception, it's used to stay present, to remain grounded in what you're actually doing rather than what you hope it leads to. In that shift, the entire dynamic transforms. What was once controlled becomes responsive. What was once forced becomes fluid. The need to constantly manage how you are seen dissolves, not because you suppressed it, but because it's no longer necessary. When nothing needs to be proven, there's nothing left to defend, no image to maintain, no impression to secure. In that absence, something stronger emerges, a quiet confidence that doesn't depend on how it's received. That confidence doesn't come from trying harder. It comes from letting go of that kind of trying altogether. There's another layer to this that involves no one else. It happens entirely inside your own head. And because of that, it's even harder to notice. You sit with a thought you don't want, maybe worry, maybe doubt, maybe an uncomfortable echo that keeps returning. Your first instinct is to get rid of it, You try to push it away, distract yourself, replace it with something better. But instead of disappearing, it lingers, repeats, grows sharper, more persistent, as if your resistance is feeding it. That's where effort starts to turn against itself, not because effort is wrong, but because it's being applied in a way that creates friction. You want to move in one direction while simultaneously holding on to the very thing you want to leave behind. That creates tension. The mind becomes divided, one part pushing, the other clinging, and in that conflict nothing resolves. Carl Jung observed this simply. What you resist persists. It doesn't mean thoughts are permanent or that you have no influence over them. It means that resistance itself becomes part of the process that sustains them. When you push against something internally, you create a psychological pressure that keeps it in place. So a different approach begins to make sense, not based on control, but on allowing. Not giving up, but removing the unnecessary resistance that keeps things stuck. When you stop trying to force a thought away, something changes. The tension around it begins to dissolve. Without that tension, the thought has less to hold on to. It doesn't vanish instantly, but it loses intensity. It becomes just another part of your awareness, not the thing that dominates it. That shift, though subtle, is crucial because it breaks the cycle of control and reaction. The Stoics came at this from a slightly different angle, but the core idea is similar. Distinguish between what is within your control and what is not. Thoughts often arise without permission. You don't choose their first appearance, but you do have influence over how you engage with them. That's the real leverage. Not preventing thoughts from showing up, but choosing not to attach to them unnecessarily. When you stop treating every thought as a problem to fix or eliminate, you create space, and in that space, the mind begins to settle on its own. What's interesting is that this doesn't feel like control in the traditional sense. It feels like stepping back, like doing less, and that can be uncomfortable at first, because it goes against the instinct to fix things immediately. But over time, it becomes clear that this kind of restraint is more effective than force. The mind starts moving more freely. Thoughts come and go without being held in place. Less urgency to react, less pressure to resolve everything instantly. In that quieter state, clarity returns, not because you forced it, but because you stopped blocking it. So the issue was never the presence of the thought itself, it was your relationship to it. The tension created by trying to eliminate it immediately. Once that tension is reduced, the whole experience changes. Instead of being trapped in a cycle of resistance, you are able to observe without reacting, to notice without latching on. That changes the direction of your attention, away from control and toward awareness. The mind becomes less crowded, not because thoughts are gone, but because they're no longer being held in place. They pass through more easily, leaving less impact. This is where effort becomes more precise. Instead of fighting against your own mind, you use it to remain steady within it, to maintain clarity without trying to force that clarity into existence. Once this becomes familiar, the pattern is easy to recognize. Each time you feel that urge to push something away, you see it for what it is, not a solution, but a source of friction. And by choosing not to engage with it the same way, you allow the process to unfold differently. The mind doesn't need to be controlled so much as understood. And once that understanding is in place, the need for force begins to fade. Creativity seems like something that should respond to effort. It feels reasonable to assume the more you push, the more you get. Sit down, concentrate, think harder, and something meaningful should emerge. That's how most work operates. So it's easy to expect the same here. But creativity doesn't follow that pattern. The moment you try to jam it into a specific shape, it starts to contract. Ideas don't expand under pressure. They shrink, hesitate, lose the fluidity they need to grow into something whole. At first it's subtle. You begin with a direction in mind, something you want to make or express. That part is natural. But then expectation builds. It has to be good, has to work, has to lead somewhere. With that expectation, your attention shifts. You are no longer exploring, you are evaluating. Every thought gets measured against a possible outcome. Every idea gets judged before it has time to develop. That judgment interrupts the process before it can move forward. Instead of allowing ideas to unfold, you start controlling them, trying to guide each step to make sure everything fits perfectly from the beginning. But that control comes at a cost. It removes the openness that creativity depends on. It replaces curiosity with pressure, and once that happens, the process becomes rigid. You are no longer discovering. You are constructing something to meet a predetermined standard. That rigidity is what blocks progress, not a lack of ideas, but a lack of space for them to evolve. You expect clarity before the process has had time to produce it, and by doing so, you cut off possibilities before they can form. Creativity needs movement. It needs room to shift, change, take unexpected directions. But when everything is tightly controlled, that movement disappears. Curiosity creates, control kills. Plato once said, "Thinking is the talking of the soul with itself." When that conversation is forced, it becomes strained and loses its rhythm. But when it's allowed to unfold naturally, it becomes fluid again. Ideas don't need to be yanked out. They need to be listened to. That requires patience. This doesn't mean effort disappears, just its role changes. Instead of being used to force results, it's used to stay engaged with the process, to keep showing up without demanding immediate outcomes. That kind of effort is quieter. It doesn't push aggressively, but it sustains the conditions creativity needs. The difficulty is that this approach feels counterintuitive. It feels like you're doing less, even though you're actually doing something more precise, removing the pressure that disrupts the process, allowing ideas to form at their own pace instead of trying to accelerate them. And while that might seem slower, it's often more effective over time. This changes how you approach creative work entirely. You stop trying to control every detail from the start. You allow things to be incomplete, to develop gradually. You give ideas room to grow instead of forcing them into a finished form too early. In that openness, something shifts. The process becomes more responsive. Instead of feeling stuck, you start moving with it. One idea leads to another without being forced. Less hesitation, less second-guessing. Not because everything is clear from the beginning, but because you've stopped trying to make it clear immediately. This is where creativity becomes sustainable. Not something that depends on constant pressure, but something that emerges from steady, open engagement. You are still involved, still active, but there's far less strain behind what you're doing. And that makes a difference, because tension narrows your thinking. It limits what you can see. It pushes you toward familiar patterns instead of new ones. But when that tension is reduced, your perspective expands. You become able to consider possibilities that wouldn't have appeared before. That's where original ideas begin to take shape. So the problem was never a lack of discipline or effort. It was the way that effort was being applied. Too much control, too much pressure, too much focus on the outcome, and all of that combined to restrict the very thing you were trying to produce. Once that becomes clear, the approach shifts naturally. You still care about the result, but you're no longer trying to force it into existence. You focus on the process instead, on showing up, engaging, and allowing things to develop without constant interference. In that shift, creativity becomes less unpredictable, not because you've learned to control it, but because you've learned how not to disrupt it. You understand where your influence helps and where it begins to interfere. That understanding changes everything. So when ideas don't come, the answer isn't always to push harder. Sometimes it's to step back just enough to remove the pressure that's blocking them, to create the space where your mind can move freely again. Once that space is there, the process begins to work as it was always meant to. At a certain point, all these patterns point in the same direction. The tension, the overthinking, the constant urge to control outcomes, it all comes back to where you are placing your attention. Not how much effort you're using, but where that effort is directed. And this is where a more grounded perspective starts to make a difference. Because without it, you easily fall into the habit of trying to manage everything at once, even the parts of life that were never yours to control in the first place. The Stoics approached this with a kind of clarity that cuts through confusion. They didn't complicate it, they reduced it to a simple distinction. There are things within your control and things that are not. Your effort, your focus, your decisions, those belong to you. But outcomes, reactions from others, timing, external events, those do not. When that line gets blurred, tension begins to build almost immediately. The more your attention drifts into what you cannot control, the less stable your actions become, not because you lack ability, but because your focus is split. Part of you is trying to act, while another part is trying to predict and manage the result of that action. Those two directions don't align. They pull against each other. One is grounded in the present, the other is fixed on an uncertain future. Epictetus captured this division with precision. Some things are up to us, and some things are not. It sounds almost too simple, but that simplicity is exactly what makes it effective. Because when you actually apply it, the difference is immediate. The moment you bring your attention back to what is yours, your effort, your choices, your response, the noise begins to settle. You stop trying to control how things will turn out. Not because you don't care, but because you recognize that caring doesn't give you control. It only adds pressure when it's aimed at the wrong place. That shift changes how you move. Less urgency to force results, less need to overcorrect every step. Your actions become more precise, not rushed, not hesitant, just clear. You do what needs to be done without layering it with unnecessary expectation. And because of that, there's less friction in the process. You are no longer working against yourself by trying to manage outcomes that aren't yours to manage. This doesn't remove uncertainty. That part remains. But it changes how you relate to it. Instead of trying to eliminate it, you work within it. You accept that results will come in their own time, shaped by factors beyond your grasp. That acceptance removes a significant amount of tension from your actions. It also brings a different kind of consistency. When your focus is tied to outcomes, your motivation rises and falls with whatever happens. If things go well, you feel confident. If they don't, you hesitate. But when your focus is on what you can control, stability increases. You act because it's within your control to act, not because you're guaranteed a specific result. That creates a steadier form of progress, one that isn't constantly interrupted by doubt or overthinking. You move forward without needing constant reassurance that things will work out. And by doing so, you actually improve your chances because your actions are no longer distorted by unnecessary pressure. There's also a kind of freedom in this that's easy to miss. When you stop trying to control everything, you release yourself from a responsibility that was never yours to begin with. You are no longer carrying the weight of every possible outcome. You are focused on what you can actually influence, and that focus is lighter, more manageable, more effective. This is where clarity starts to replace confusion. Decisions become simpler because they're based on what you can do, not on what might happen. You are no longer trying to calculate every possible result before taking action. You respond to the present moment with the information you have, and that's enough. Over time, this changes how you experience effort itself. It becomes less strained, less reactive. You're still engaged, still committed, but there's less tension behind it. You are not forcing things into place. You are allowing them to unfold while doing your part with precision. And that precision matters, because when your actions are aligned with what you can control, they become more effective. Not because you've guaranteed the outcome, but because you've removed the internal obstacles that were getting in the way. Less hesitation, less second guessing, more direct movement. This is the same pattern showing up again, just in a more grounded form. The less you try to control what isn't yours, the more effective you become in what is. The more you release your grip on outcomes, the more clearly you are able to act. So the shift isn't about doing less. It's about doing what actually belongs to you and letting the rest move on its own. Once that line becomes clear, the tension that once felt unavoidable begins to fade. What's left is something quieter but far more stable. Way of moving through things without constantly trying to control them. And in that steadiness, your actions begin to carry a kind of clarity that doesn't need to be forced. Something shifts when you stop caring in this specific way. And it's not the kind of shift most people expect. It doesn't make you passive. It doesn't drain your motivation or make you indifferent to what happens. If anything, it sharpens you, but it sharpens you by removing what was never helping in the first place. The pressure, the constant checking, the quiet need for things to turn out a certain way, those begin to fall away. Once they do, your actions start to look different. On the surface, you're still doing the same things, working, moving, making decisions, but internally, there's less noise, less tension behind each step. You are no longer measuring every action against an imagined result. You're not pausing to evaluate whether what you're doing will be enough, whether it will lead somewhere, whether it will work out exactly as planned. You are simply acting within the moment you're in. That difference might seem small, but it changes everything. Because when you remove that constant layer of evaluation, your actions become more direct. Less hesitation, less overcorrection. You don't interrupt yourself as often. That allows a kind of momentum to build, not through force, but through continuity. One action leads naturally into the next without being weighed down by doubt. This is where the distinction between reacting and responding becomes clear. When you're attached to outcomes, you react. You adjust constantly based on what you think might happen or what just happened. Your actions become tied to results that are still unfolding. But when that attachment loosens, you respond instead. You act based on what is actually in front of you, not on projections or fears. That response is cleaner, more stable. Marcus Aurelius captured this state with quiet precision. If you seek tranquility, do less. It doesn't mean doing nothing. It means removing the unnecessary, the extra layers of thought, the constant need to control, the tension that doesn't contribute to the action itself. Once those layers are stripped away, what remains is far more effective. Your attention becomes grounded, not scattered across outcomes and possibilities, but focused on the task itself. You are not thinking 3 steps ahead while trying to act in the present. You are here, fully engaged with what you're doing. Because of that, your actions carry more weight, not because you're forcing them, but because they're no longer diluted by distraction. This also changes how you experience effort. It no longer feels like pushing against resistance. It feels more like moving with something. There's still energy, still commitment, but it's not strained, it's directed. You are not trying to bend the process to fit your expectations. You are working within it, allowing it to unfold while doing your part with clarity. In that clarity, something important disappears. The friction that was slowing everything down. The internal conflict between what you're doing and what you wish would happen. That conflict used to sit behind every action, quietly interfering. But once the need to control outcomes is reduced, that interference fades. You begin to notice how much smoother things feel. Decisions come more quickly, not because you're rushing, but because you are no longer overanalyzing every possibility. You trust your ability to respond in the moment rather than trying to predict everything in advance. That trust creates a different kind of stability. It's not based on certainty. It's based on alignment. You are aligned with what you can actually do, rather than what you hope will happen. That alignment removes a lot of unnecessary strain. You are no longer carrying the weight of outcomes that haven't even occurred yet. This doesn't mean everything suddenly works out perfectly. Results are still influenced by factors outside your control, but your relationship with those results changes. You are less affected by them, less thrown off when things don't go exactly as expected, and because of that, you are able to continue acting without disruption. That continuity is what makes the difference over time. Not a single perfect action, but a steady flow of clear, undistorted ones. Actions that aren't constantly interrupted by doubt or pressure. As those actions accumulate, they naturally lead to better outcomes. Not because you forced those outcomes into place, but because you removed what was getting in the way of reaching them. The process was always capable of producing results. It just needed to function without interference. There's also a quiet confidence that begins to form in this state. Not the kind that needs to prove itself, but one that comes from experience. You see that when you act without unnecessary pressure, things tend to move more smoothly. You trust that process more, not because it guarantees anything, but because it works consistently. That trust reinforces the shift. It makes it easier to let go of the need to control everything, to focus on what's in front of you, and to allow the rest to unfold, not as a passive choice, but as a deliberate one. So what really changes isn't your level of effort, but the quality of it. You are no longer pushing against yourself. You are no longer dividing your attention between action and outcome. You are fully engaged in what you're doing, and that engagement carries you forward. In that forward movement, something becomes clear. The results you were trying to force begin to appear, not all at once, not perfectly, but steadily. And they come not because you chased them harder, but because you stopped interfering with the actions that create them. Release control and you'll find direction. What remains is a cleaner way of moving through things, one that doesn't rely on force, but on clarity. And that clarity, once established, tends to carry everything else with it. There's a quiet strength in letting go of what was never yours to control, not giving up, not stepping back from effort, but removing the tension that was holding you in place. When you stop forcing, you start seeing clearly. When you stop chasing, you start moving forward. And in that shift, things begin to fall into place in a way that effort alone could never create. If this way of thinking resonates with you, there's another video on the screen that goes even deeper into this path. Take a moment and continue the journey. And thank you for being a part of Stoic Path Daily.